Our next speaker is Mr. Jack Aiello. He received his bachelor degree in both computer science and math, in addition to multiple degrees from MIT. In 1995, he was diagnosed with multiple myeloma and underwent a tandem autologous stem cell transplant. He participated in a thalidomide phase 1-2 clinical trial in 1997, followed by a full allogeneic transplant in 1998. He experienced GVHD and underwent radiation for plasmacytomas from 1999 to 2001. He also participated in a phase 2 clinical trial for neuropathy in 2002. He is currently in complete remission, but continues to experience long-term side effects from treatment. He is an active patient advocate for the community throughout the nation, including participation on the National Cancer Institute's Myeloma Steering Committee and Patient Advocacy Steering Committee, the SWOG's Cooperative Group Myeloma Committee, and patient advocacy committees as well, in addition to participation on Stanford's Scientific Review Committee in clinical trials, and that just names a very few of all of his amazing advocacy activities. We are truly honored to have Mr. Jack Aiello speak to us today.
I'm very slow in getting organized. So my name is Jack Aiello. I'm really happy to be here. I've learned a lot already in this meeting, having sat through the prior two presentations. And I'm really pleased to meet some of you and be able to share with you why I think it's so important, especially since you're involved with patients, to help them become advocates. And so that's what I wanted to talk about, sharing my experience with you and asking you to get your patients involved in doing the same. Works. So my objectives for this meeting are to talk about how you can help patients become advocates for themselves, how you can also share information with them about clinical trials, both understanding them and make them known about how important trials are, not only for the relapsed patients, but also for the newly diagnosed patients. And get them involved to try to volunteer with various advocacy organizations. And I thought I'd do this by sharing my own story, which hopefully you're able to replicate. I wanted to talk about being your own advocate, which means also becoming familiar with labs and statistics and clinical trials, and there's a lot of information there. How does one start becoming an advocate? And my own current advocacy work, which was just described, but we'll go a little bit further into it. So my background, 1994 was a great year for me. I had been married at that time over 20 years, had 2 teenage daughters, which kind of keeps you going, and a 10-year-old son who I had coached that year in Little League. I was VP of marketing for a company, a high-tech company, which I had helped take public that year. And then in 1995, I started to have a backache. So if you're familiar with myeloma, you might say, yeah, that's kind of a normal result of having myeloma. But it wasn't clear to me what was going on. I went to an orthopedic back specialist who did MRIs and X-rays that didn't show anything out of the ordinary. He just suggested that I get 3 weeks of bed rest, which was extremely painful. My back hurt whether I was lying down, standing, walking, sitting. And so all 3 weeks of bed rest was that I was falling further behind in my work. And I went back to him And I said, that didn't work. What do we do now? And he said he was going to do something called a myelogram. I didn't know what it was. Apparently, you take a blood test one week, and then you have some dye injected down your back the following week to get a better look at what's going on. And after I took that blood test, and after 2 months of excruciating pain on a weekend, my back stopped hurting. My back hasn't hurt in 21 years. And so I went to the guy and I said, cancel the myelogram, which did sound like it was going to hurt, and I'm out of here. And he said, wait a minute. The blood test you took, and 21 years later, I still remember his words. The blood test you took showed you have an elevated protein. Well, I felt great. Nothing wrong with so much protein. And he continued, you have an elevated protein that shows you probably have a cancer. Whoa, I finally feel good and I have a cancer called multiple myeloma. Whoa, haven't heard that. And he was really a good guy. He explained a lot of other stuff to me, except you don't hear it. Somebody says you have cancer, and you're just kind of thinking about other things. So I remember, well, I thought, being smart enough to ask him 2 questions. How do I spell myeloma? And I had him actually write it down on his business card because I wasn't going to remember. And what's single myeloma? I feel pretty good. Maybe I don't have it as bad as whatever multiple myeloma might be. Well, you laugh, but I thought that was just a great question. And he explained there's not really any such thing. As you're aware, some people are diagnosed with solitary plasmacytomas, and that might be what single myeloma refers to. So we just refer to it as myeloma, and I went to a neighboring hospital library, and I looked things up and confirmed what he told me. There were a couple of treatment options out there, but once diagnosed with treatment, since there was no cure, the average lifespan was just 2 to 3 years. And I remember going home to my wife and sharing the little bit I understood about this disease with her, and suffice it to say, we had a good cry. And I was being scheduled to go into a hospital to have this 96-hour infusion of a chemotherapy. And I remember having to explain to my kids, why was I going to be going to a hospital? And I said something like, there's something wrong with my blood, and we should fix it in about 8 months. And my 16-year-old daughter asked, does that mean you have cancer? And it's still hard for me to repeat that sentence. And I'm not even sure how I answered her. So I went into the hospital, and I started getting treatment. But I felt good, remember. So I was, I had my marketing staff visiting me to read through stuff or sign off on things, and family and friends were visiting me. And then this one gal walked in, who I didn't recognize. She was a social worker. And she explained that the Leukemia Society of America, which is what Leukemia and Lymphoma Society used to be called, she said the Leukemia Society of America, LSA, was having a support group meeting in the hospital tonight. And I'd encourage you to go and share your story. Well, hell, I didn't know what my story was. And I wasn't so interested in going to some touchy-feely group. And I said to her, I don't have leukemia. I have myeloma. Off you go. And she refused to leave and told me that LSA actually supported all blood cancers, of which myeloma was one. So to make a long story short, I actually dragged my IV pole up to the second floor and went to this meeting and listened to folks say things like, I have AML, acute myelogenous leukemia, but I had no idea what it was. Or another patient said, I have non-Hodgkin's disease. Didn't know what a Hodgkin's was, so a non-Hodgkin's didn't really mean anything to me either. And then one patient named Jim actually said he had multiple myeloma. And that was the most important meeting I think I ever went to, because it was so important for me to see someone living and breathing with this disease that was inevitably fatal. So I encourage all of you, especially for the newly diagnosed patients, to try to find a support group meeting locally for them. It means an awful lot to meet other patients who can help direct you to other resources available. And Jim helped me with that. For myeloma, there was an International Myeloma Foundation, which had been established by then. There was a local support group, which was really involved in delivering information and experiences about the disease and inviting some specialists to speak. By the way, I'm from the Bay Area here, so that myeloma support group was started in '91, and I've been going to it since '95, and I've been facilitating it since around 2000. So if you're local here, we have a great myeloma support group. For me, I had a very good oncologist. He was the second one, though. The first one that was kind of assigned to me, I asked him how many myeloma patients he was seeing, and when he said 2, I kind of thought that wasn't enough experience. And I started interviewing other oncologists, hematologists, and one guy said he had 12 patients that he was currently seeing, and that to me was an order of magnitude better. The only problem was that he was kind of balding and had gray hair, and I wanted him around for the long term, so I asked him, how long are you going to be working at this? And he said he has teenage daughters, like I did, and he planned to be in the business for a while. And so he was actually my doctor for quite a while. But he encouraged me also to investigate other myeloma expertise. So I did. My research first took me to Stanford, which didn't really have a strong myeloma program in '95. And ultimately, I was treated in Little Rock, Arkansas, where there is a strong myeloma program even today. In '96, I had what's called a tandem autologous transplant. So you get 2 transplants right in a row. And unfortunately for me, that only gave me about a 1.5 year remission. So with Arkansas, I decided to enter my first clinical trial. I had actually entered one earlier, but I was going to be patient number 12 in that trial, and patient number 2 died, and so I was told the trial was canceled. So the one I entered was for a drug called thalidomide, and it showed to have myeloma patients respond to the drug, about 1/3 of them. Unfortunately, I wasn't one of them, and at this point I had run out of treatments except for one, and that was a 3rd transplant, except this time an allogeneic transplant, which isn't done very often for myeloma patients. That's a transplant that requires donor stem cells. I had a sister that was fully compatible, and she provided her stem cells for me to get through that. That results in graft versus host disease. I also had some plasmacytomas that had to be radiated due to the high doses of thalidomide and radiation. You saw me walk up here not very quickly because it's caused significant neuropathy for me. But the fact is, after 2 or 3 years of graft versus host disease, so now we're up to 2001, I haven't been on any treatment. So I've been really, really lucky. But I couldn't work anymore. I did a lot of traveling for my job. I did a lot of running around, and I wasn't able to do those things and had to go on medical disability, which for me gave me a chance to get more involved with advocacy, even though I didn't quite know what that was. Instead, when I had to go on medical disability, I just contacted the CEOs that I had gotten to know at these nonprofit organizations, our local Leukemia and Lymphoma Society Executive Director, the International Myeloma Foundation founders, the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation founders, and said, I'm available to help. Have you got anything for me? And LLS had an office locally that I was able to go into and still go into, just to volunteer. And the other organizations which weren't local still got me involved in other activities. I thought as part of advocacy for yourself, patients really need to understand how they can determine if a treatment is working. And patients should always be asking you, but if they don't, you should be providing their labs, whether it's on paper or whether it's on internet applications now. They should have immediate access to their lab results. And they should be able to understand the reference ranges and the high and low markers and figure out how to interpret those. And ask doctors, well, what markers are you looking at to see if my treatment is working? As patients become more educated in those various markers for their diseases, they really become advocates for themselves. They begin to learn that maybe it's not the value of a marker that's so important, but rather the trend or graph, as you saw earlier, of that marker. Which direction are those results going in? Patients can use Excel spreadsheets. Organizations have spreadsheets customized for certain treatments, like the IMF has something called Myeloma Manager that works on a PC and it makes it very easy to graph stuff. And if you can make patients aware of those, that's really going to help the patient become their own best advocate. They'll begin to learn definitions of complete responses and progression-free survival and overall survival and minimum residual disease and so many more that are really overwhelming when one is diagnosed or when one is shown examples of clinical trial results. But after you see it enough times, you begin to learn what's important when deciding whether or not to go through a clinical trial. And to learn about p-values and hazard ratios and confidence intervals. There are sites on the internet that really can provide good training. Understanding clinical trials. First of all, the word clinical trial is really a scary term. It's clinical, which sounds like it's kind of engineering-wise, and it's a trial, meaning patients think they're going to be a guinea pig. And then you throw in the word placebos, and they're scared to death that, one, they are being looked at as lab rats, and two, if they have heard good things about drugs, and you indicate, well, you might get it. It's randomized, but you might get it. That's the reason that patients don't necessarily sign up if they're not assured to be able to get the drug. Excuse me for that. But it's still really important to make those patients aware of trials. There are ways to find out about them. There's the infamous clinicaltrials.gov. Not exactly the most patient-friendly website to go through. But good advocacy organizations like LLS or IMF for myeloma have staff on board that can help you work through what trials might be available for you. And so, again, getting them knowledgeable of the disease advocacy group that can help them can really be a benefit. I just saw a great video about learning about clinical trials. There are many around. And I would absolutely show those to patients and wouldn't be shy about doing that. My own advocacy. Well, first of all, you have to kind of define what types of advocacy is there. I've been talking at this point mostly about patient advocacy. For me, that's been as a support group leader. I've spoken to many other patient groups. I've even spoken to pharma companies who will ask me to talk to their folks in the white coats because they don't get to see many patients. And I think, and I'm told, that talking to the scientists as a patient helps them understand what patients go through because they don't get to see many patients. Another type of advocacy is legislative. Maybe you have a patient who's really politically minded and wants to be involved at the state or federal level and meet with their congressional folks to talk about potential bills and voting that can affect patients, whether it's bills currently out there to try to create what's called oral parity so that oral drugs aren't so expensive to patients these days. Many states already have oral parity laws, but that doesn't apply to all insurance organizations, including Medicare. And federal is trying to rectify that on a federal level, but it's a long ways to go. Maybe it has to do with, a bill has to do with funding for NCI or NIH. Patients can get involved in that, and typically there are advocacy organizations out there that will want patients to share their stories with legislative folks. It means an awful lot to speak to a senator or congressperson or your local representatives as a patient and as a constituent. They enjoy doing that. I personally try to fundraise. I think in the last 10 years, I've fundraised over $400,000 for myeloma research. And again, these organizations like HOPE, like IMF, like others are always looking for potential fundraisers. There are things you can do on a national walk basis if you want, or there are things you can do in your home. I do a Texas Hold'em poker fundraiser every November and have about 30 people in my house and raise $5,000 or $6,000. So you can go small, you can go big. But it gets the patient involved more with the organizations and the disease. And then there's research. I think that's the most difficult arm of advocacy to get involved with. First of all, most patients don't have the medical knowledge that you all, and I wish I had. I was a lot of computer science and engineering and wish maybe it had been more biology and chemistry. But you can learn. There are organizations like Research Advocacy Network and such that offer research programs to advocates. On my own, I've been fortunate enough the last 3 or 4 years to become an advocate for myeloma committees run by the NCI. I'm very proud to be part of SWOG and their patient advocate on the myeloma committee. The Center for International Blood and Marrow Transplant Research has a patient advocacy group of which I'm part of. I can do things locally, and patients can investigate on their own locally if they've got a hospital that treats their disease and is large enough to have and run clinical trials. So for me, that's kept me quite busy, out of my wife's hair, as we go forward. So how does a patient start getting involved with advocacy? Well, as being a patient advocate, they can join a support group in person or online. they can contact cancer organizations, whether it's a broad cancer organization like the American Cancer Society, or disease specifics like the pancreatic cancer or the myeloma groups or hematology groups. And they can volunteer for these organizations. That starts to get them involved because you see what these organizations are doing to help move cancer research forward. And as a volunteer, you become more vested in your own disease when you see this kind of thing happening. Legislative-wise, as I mentioned, you can visit these disease organizations often coordinate visits to Capitol Hill, or locally you can visit any of the legislative folks who have offices. Fundraising, as I mentioned, there are ACS has Relay for Life. Light the Night is a big fundraiser for the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. For those of you that are local, our Peninsula South Bay Light the Night will be October 27th at the new soccer stadium across from San Jose Airport. And again, I said research was the hardest thing to get involved with. And for research, the best advice I can give is for patients to find a mentor. Chances are a mentor is someone who you've met through those other types of advocacy. Maybe they've been diagnosed longer than you. Maybe they are already active on the research arm. In any case, that really helped me because I have a good friend who happens to be an MD and also a long-term myeloma survivor who got me involved with a couple of the organizations, specifically NCI and CIBMTR. And I think as being new on those patients, you begin to be intimidated by doctors when you're supposed to suggest your point of view from a patient's perspective. But as you get to know them, most of the really good doctors in the area really do want to hear the patient's perspective. So when you're advising your patient about any of these programs, if they're available to them, tell them not to be shy. Tell them to speak up. Tell them to take a chair at the main table because, honestly, patient advocacy in the research arena is really important. Why do you advocate? Well, I can tell you reasons I advocate. First of all, it feels good to give back. I know that there were people before me that helped lead the way and lead the charge in success of new drug development. For my purposes, even though I haven't been on any treatment in the last almost 15 years, there have been a dozen drugs approved for myeloma during that time frame. So it keeps me educated, which is important. I facilitate a support group. I want to let them know what the results of new clinical trials are and what new trials are out there to further those results. I enjoy helping others. I know a lot of really wonderful doctors and nurses. In fact, my nurse at Stanford, as she has moved different departments, I've changed doctors just to follow her because she knows me the best. And it's important to keep busy in retirement, as my wife will tell me. But the biggest reason is my family. The young lady on your right is that 16-year-old daughter, Erin, who now, for the last dozen years, has been doing breast cancer research. She's the one who asked, do I have cancer? The daughter on the left holding the newborn, she went into dolphin training, so I don't know where she got that. And that son, tall guy in the middle, blonde-haired, he's the one I coached in Little League, and I'd always wondered, well, if I wasn't going to be around, who was going to coach him the following year when he would be advancing to a new league and have to hit a curveball? Who was going to teach him to hit that curveball? Well, fortunately, since I've survived this long, I did get to see him play high school ball. Never could hit a curveball. But I've always been fortunate. I got to see him graduate from college. I was able to set some long-term goals, and now I've seen him conduct orchestras, which is his passion. And I'd always told my daughters that I can't wait to walk you down the aisle and bounce a grandkid on my lap in that order. And as you can see, I've gotten to bounce 4 grandkids on my lap now. So I'm really, really lucky. So that's me. I'm happy to talk with any of you, answer any questions. You're welcome to email me. You're welcome to call me if there's anything I can do to help you or help your patients. But most importantly, thank you for what you do. It's really, really critical, and I know how patients appreciate what you're doing, even if we don't necessarily say it. We do appreciate it. Thank you.